Hi, and good afternoon, and welcome to the Tech23 Impact Circles. It's wonderful to have you join us for what's sure to be a great conversation exploring next generation nuclear medicine. As is custom, I would first like to acknowledge both the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Bunurong and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where the Slatterys team meets, works, and creates. We pay our respects to the elders both past and present, and emerging, and we also acknowledge that people are joining today from other traditional lands and nations and extend our respects to their custodians, ancestors, elders, and future leaders. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Hi, Rachel.
Hello, Adina. I'm really looking forward to today's circle on nuclear medicine, and I want to thank today's contributors and welcome them to Christian, Chris, David, Rosanne and Brad, and of course Tim and the team at ANSTO for helping us put this circle together. I want to welcome everyone zooming in. One of the best things about zooming in is the ability to reach people from all across the country. So say hello, introduce yourselves on the chat now and tell us where you're zooming in from. Tech23 is all about amplifying the people and the organisations that are chipping away at some of the greatest challenges we face. Coming to you any which way, Tech23 2020 will be shining a light for the 12th year on 23 young, high potential companies. We have a real person lunch on the 10th of December for those lucky enough to get to Sydney, where the amazing Mike Walsh will be speaking. And we have more circles. We've got one tomorrow on CyberSec and a couple more next week and more in December. So please make sure you check out the website. None of this could be possible without the support of the Tech23 sponsors. So I just want to call out Oz Industry, UNSW, Main Sequence with CSIRO, the New South Wales Government, Macquarie University, Addison's, ANSTO and Cicada Innovations for all of their support. We couldn't do it without them. Today we're basically going to eavesdrop on a conversation between these wonderful contributors, and then we're going to ask you to share your questions in the chat or on the mural board. You can also secretly send them to me and Adina if you prefer. And then if time permits, we'll then hopefully break into small groups to give people the opportunity to chat and talk amongst themselves. It's really great to be connecting, isn't it, Adina?
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, it is indeed. Now, we have a couple of last minute reminders for you. So you would have seen in your email reminder in the Zoom chat, there is a link to the Slatterys Community Charter, which is a great read if you need guidance on what kind of behaviour that's encouraged at the circles. Now, just reiterating to confirm the order today, we'll be starting with Tim and the contributors, kicking off the conversation, followed by audience Q&A from all of you, and we'll finish with some randomised deep dive breakout rooms. Now, we're using a shared mural board to capture your thoughts, which we are sharing in the Slack now, and chats rather. Please feel free to add whatever you like to this board, drawings or stickies, whatever you like.
Could I ask, Adina, we need permission to record this. Is it okay to record the session?
This is actually being recorded and we will actually share it with the post-event.
Okay, great.
Thank you. You actually just answered what I was about to say next. As Rachel mentioned, we'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to every one of the Circle contributors and all of the sponsors of Tech23 and supporters for helping to make today's session and the others come into being. We also want to thank all of you for dialing in. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Tim rather to kick things off. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Adina and Rachel. So my name's Tim Boyle and I'm the Circle leader for today's discussion on next generation nuclear medicines. For full disclosure, I am Director of Innovation and Commercialisation at ANSTO, Australia's nuclear science and technology organisation. And for full disclosure as well, I have business dealings with all of our expert panel members today as either a customer, competitor or supplier, or any combination of those, because that's the nature of this industry. It's rapidly growing and we all have different roles and focuses that overlap. Joining me today are our expert panel, Christian Behrenbruch, CEO of Telix Pharmaceuticals. Christian is a serial healthcare entrepreneur. Welcome, Christian. David James is Global Head of Manufacturing Operations at Oncosil and is a recognised expert in implantable radioembolism medical devices. So welcome, David. Rosanne Robertson is General Manager of ANSTO Business Development and a Non-Executive Director with Advanced Molecular Therapeutics and Clarity Pharmaceuticals. So welcome, Rosanne. And Brad Walsh is CEO of Glytherix and Mynamic International, as well as Managing Director of iProteome. Thank you for joining us, Brad. I thought the best way to start this would be kick off with some questions. And the common theme for all our panelists is nuclear medicine. However, we all have very different products targeting different indications via very different mechanisms of action. What does the term nuclear medicine mean to you? Maybe we could start with Chris.
Wow. You know, sounds like a pretty straightforward question, but it probably isn't. I think nuclear medicine these days is I don't think we should talk about nuclear medicine anymore. I think we should talk about radiation oncology in a very general sense. I think nuclear medicine is kind of a dead art clinically. You know, in the United States, for example, nuclear medicine is a pretty niche area. Radiologists control a big swath of nuclear medicine, which is PET imaging. In Europe, nuclear medicine is more an alive and well discipline, but you know, I think clinical fields like urology are starting to get more greedy about the capabilities in the space. So I think we should be focused on, you know, the type of things that Oncosil does, like implantable devices, pharmaceuticals, like what Telix does, and then external sources of irradiation, and then of course the radiology aspects. These all touch and interface to nuclear medicine. And you know, we announced a collaboration recently with a company called Reflection in the Bay Area that's doing PET guided external beam radiation. You know, they're actually shooting X-ray beams at the PET signal in a PET camera in a LINAC. So I think nuclear medicine is starting to pervade all of these areas, and we should take a more holistic view as a consequence. So I didn't really answer your question, but it sounded good in my head.
No, thanks, Chris. And I think that's the point of what we're trying to get at here, is that we have a rapidly changing and emerging industry, which traditionally has been around diagnosis of tumours and other things, and we're moving very much into the treatment phase, and it is evolving, and certain terms like nuclear medicine may not be the best way to describe what we do anymore. Brad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I like what Chris said about refocusing it to radiation oncology, and I think for us it's a solution. So what we've got is a new target and an antibody, and there's not much known about them. So nuclear medicine is an ideal approach because we can adopt a Theranostics approach. So we can actually look for with one radioisotope on our antibody, look for those who are positive to the target and see that their tumours are likely to respond, and then take another radioisotope for treatment. So we can put those things together. So it actually jumps us quite a way forward in showing that, yes, we have patients that are likely to respond, and particularly when you're in early phase trials, you really want to maximise your opportunity for those trials to succeed and bring treatment to patients that have not had that treatment before. Thanks, Brad. And David?
Yeah, I like both of those sentiments as going towards personalised dosimetry. If you look at the idea of, say in our product, an implantable medical device straight in, putting high energy radiation directly into a tumour, the old mentality of that's pretty much a non-specific killer. It's going to just kick the hell out of things very close in. If you want to achieve the best clinical results from a product like that, you have to get into the more what type of tumor you're treating, what is the dosimetry, how are you going to image that, how are you going to get the theranostic type approach so you can get the best outcome for people and move from, say, just a palliative care type product to a more of a product that's going to achieve real outcomes for people. Yeah. Thanks, David. And Rosanne, obviously you at ANSTO, we play across multiple different areas. So
what does nuclear medicine mean from your perspective, experienced across multiple different sectors?
Thanks, Tim. Look, I think I would concur with all the other panelists. The terminology in nuclear medicine seems to be changing rapidly, whether it's molecular imaging, theranostics, radiotheranostics. I think there's the precision that the drugs and devices that are being developed are bringing to clinical care, and the outcomes that we're seeing are, truly remarkable. But the word nuclear, particularly in the Australian context, is not always seen as palatable. I think that's why, not just in Australia, but globally, we're looking at different ways to describe, the products that we're making and the impact that they're having on patients.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that really sums up. This is really a broad area. I think the common theme really is that using radiation, and radiation can be used for two purposes. Really, those that are coming new to this area, radiation can be used to measure and trace something. But it could also be used to deposit high energy at a certain location. I think that's really the diagnostic versus the therapy applications. The theme of this circle is next generation nuclear medicine. It's going beyond the current state of the art. What are the most exciting technology trends that you're seeing in the nuclear medicine sector at the moment? What technologies and companies are you personally keeping an eye on, and that maybe we should be watching? And what are the opportunities surrounding this next generation of technologies? Chris, do you want to go first?
Well, I think you should be watching a really excellent ASX listed company called Telix Pharmaceuticals. You loaded that up. And actually, to be generous, I think Australia and Australian companies do nuclear medicine and radiation biology particularly well. When I came back to Australia after being away for about 20 years, it was very natural to start a company here because we've got great resources like ANSTO, and Tim and Rosanne, what you do at ANSTO is really important. It's important for the globe. It'd be nice if you were making a bit more technetium, but we can take that offline, I suppose. I think that I think we've got really fantastic clinicians. You got to look at guys like in terms of our forefathers, we had guys like Harvey Turner who really led some of the big changes in the field. And then, guys like Andrew Scott and Rod Hicks, who I think defined nuclear medicine. And then we've got some upcomers like Michael Hoffman that may, have some legs in the industry, longer term. So I think, the clinical base is here. It's a great place to do clinical trials. I think all the companies that are represented here, we all do clinical trials in Australia because it's a great place to do clinical science in this area. And so what that does is it gives us a lot of exposure to what technologies are coming over the horizon. And I think I agree with your point, Rosanne, about the nuclear piece. Nuclear medicine's basically heading in a direction where the nuclear component isn't going to be all that visible at some point in time. And one of the reasons why I think the world got more interested in nuclear medicine over the last, decade is because we're moving away from hard to use isotopes like I-131 and phosphorus and yttrium and things that are, they're highly, they have high utility and they absolutely have their place. But we're moving now towards things where the clinical environment that you need to treat patients doesn't look all that different from another cytotoxic drug, where you can treat patients on an outpatient basis and send them home. There isn't an ambulatory radiation problem. And so I think that trend, which is a mega trend that makes it more tractable for this industry to go ahead, is an incredibly important one. And so, I think particularly noting not just lutetium, which is, it's a workhorse isotope that's available today. And again, it's great to see an organization like ANSTO being an important part of the global supply chain for that. That has a big impact, by the way, in terms of the knowledge base and the capability that's here in Australia. But I think that the alpha field, we have a huge investment in alpha therapy. We probably have the biggest pipeline in alpha therapeutics in the world. We're investing heavily in what are going to be essentially indistinguishable from other cytotoxic drugs. You know, the package is going to be paper shielding instead of lead shielding on the main. And, you know, the opportunities to really deliver radiation, you know, to go from the box in the basement, you know, the LINAC will be there for a while, but I'd say 10, 15 years from now, a very large proportion of the treatments that we're going to undertake are going to be pharmaceutical, and they're going to be nuclear medicine treatments, but they're going to be indistinguishable from, you know, the other types of oncology products that we routinely use. So I'll pause there. And I mean, I've got a bunch of other ideas, but I don't want to hog all the airtime. So, you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe Rosanne, do you have anything to sort of tag on to that? Given that I've thrown you a bone like 4 times in that conversation.
Thanks, Chris. I think certainly, look, I agree with all of that. Australia is a great environment for nuclear medicine and for different various devices and medicines that are being developed. Our clinical trials landscape is, and our regulatory framework is quite accepting of those early stage trials. I think what, for me, in the last sort of 10 plus years that I've been involved is mainstream pharma sort of exited nuclear medicine. 10 years ago, it was all about diagnostics. And I think it's really encouraging to see mainstream pharma come back into the field, but looking at those therapeutics and putting those in the same class as other oncology applications. So I think that's, you know, that's an exciting opportunity for our field, whether it be a medicine or a device.
David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah,
you come up from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, slightly different angle. Even though I'm a chemist, I'm really doing medical devices. I noticed Christian poured water on both phosphorus and yttrium, which are both products I've worked with in Certex and here at Oncosil. But I think one thing that I was interesting a while back, I was, before COVID-19, I was overseas and was interested in talking to some people over in Europe about why there is a lot of investment in nuclear medicine, or appears to be, over in nuclear medicine in the old-fashioned sense over in Europe at the moment. And it seems to me that, I don't know what the other panelists think, is that the pipeline, a lot of the drug pipelines from big pharma, some of the areas that we're watching, are a bit weak at the moment. And so a lot of people are looking at nuclear/radioisotopes, radiotherapies, to join with their current therapies. I think Christian mentioned with chemotherapy and all that sort of stuff, to enhance their product range in ways that they've never looked at before. And so we're seeing a couple of quite little small startups coming into people that we're working with over in Europe, and there seems to be a lot of, they're still in early stages. They're not growing. Lutetium's big. Lutetium is a buzzword at the moment, big time, as long as it's generated correctly. And that's the one that I know of mostly is happening. But there seems to be a lot of, is there a nuclear way, or is there a radiopharmaceutics way of enhancing current weak pipelines from big pharma?
I agree. I want to say, David, my apologies. I didn't mean to.
No, it's okay. I didn't take it there.
For the avoidance of doubt, Telix is developing I-131 and yttrium-based products as well. So we are not. And look, I think I-131 is a fabulous isotope. I mean, it's super cheap. Yttrium is a very well proven, isotope in nuclear medicine. It's also very accessible. So, but the bottom line is, nuclear medicine companies like yours and ours can get excited about whatever isotope we want. And the reality of it is that, as I think Rosanne alluded to, I think there's the patient consideration, about what does the word nuclear in a therapy mean, and that's not a trivial sell in some aspects. I mean, even for imaging, even for diagnostic imaging, we see patients all the time that get to the point in a clinical trial where they're ready to sign a consent form to do the imaging study, and then they see the word nuclear there, and they're like, wow, so I'm going to get radiation. Like, doesn't matter that it's the equivalent of radiation from flying, I don't know, Melbourne to Sydney and back. Maybe a little bit more, but not a whole lot more. You know what I mean? So
right.
I think that the pharma direction. I mean, you know, we talk to big pharma all the time, and it doesn't matter what efficacy we show them in, you know, lutetium or whatever. They go, yeah, that's great and that's interesting, and you know, we'll keep a watching brief. But what are you doing in alpha? And
right,
I think that, you know, sort of does reflect the mentality of the industry. And the irony of it is, there's no supply chain for any of those alpha emitting isotopes. I mean, zero, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even if you wanted, even if you had a kick-ass product today, I mean, I look at, for example, you know, a company like Fusion Pharmaceuticals or Actinium Pharmaceuticals developing, you know, purely actinium-based products. And I think to myself, what side of the next decade are you actually planning on selling a product? Because you're just not. Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's the balance, isn't it, between the sexy new stuff that we have in nuclear medicine, which I think, to your point, the immuno-oncology is the nexus where we can play together with pharma, no matter what the isotope is. But I think the reality of it is that we've got a current generation of products, and I include things like copper 64, 67 in there. That's current generation. That's technically tractable, although still scarce, but technically tractable based on the technologies we have today. I think there's a crop of products that we need to get out there. And unfortunately, or fortunately for your shareholders and our shareholders, it's not going to be a big pharma that does it. It's going to be a nuclear medicine company that does it.
Yeah, right.
And that's an opportunity as well.
Brad, what are your thoughts on the sort of who to watch? And, you know, we've seen alphas and sort of more precision-based approaches. What are your thoughts on what to watch? What are the next over-the-horizon technologies that are coming in this space?
So for us, it's interesting because CEO of an immuno-oncology startup who's chosen to use radiation to arm those antibodies. So we very much do watch Telix and Oncosil, Certex, Clarity with a view to seeing them actually educating the investment market. So, you know, that's the first part of it. So as Christian pointed out, you know, you've got to get down to the patients and have them educated so that they're willing to do it. But up on this end, it is these companies that are leading the way in Australia that are actually also allowing the investors to see, yes, there is a viable industry here, and that's very important. Then down the other end, you've got people like Genesis Care and Icon who, you know, are working to get those therapies to the patients, not just here in Australia, but, you know, Genesis Care has done a very good deal in the US. And the other one that I'd point out, which again is really antibody focused, and I make no apology for that, are also companies like Catalent with their smart tag technology, or Adina, where they've got their ThioBridge technology, which allows you to control your drug antibody ratio. So in this case, you know, the number of chelates that are there that will chelate the number of radioactive molecules that you have on the drug. And, you know, I certainly think as more of these drugs come into the clinic and you get to the FDA, the more ability you have to define your molecule in many different aspects, including, you know, how many, the control of how much radiation is on that particular antibody is important. So, you know, I think there's a very wide spectrum of companies and service providers in this industry that are beginning to come together. And certainly I'd echo what Christian said in terms of actinium. It's very interesting. We've been you know, doing some work with some of the guys like John Babbage at Weill Cornell, and it is an issue. You know, how are you going to supply that? So it looks great. And if you've ever seen the beautiful picture of the man full of prostate cancer micrometastases who had one shot of PSMA with actinium-225 on it, and it disappeared. So, you know, it's a wonderful story, but supply is an issue. And obviously one of the things that we have, as Tim disclosed, we're working together with ANSTO in a CRCP grant. And part of that is trying to develop a shake and bake kit where you can have your chelated antibody, you can have your radioisotope both delivered to the radio pharmacy where it can be put together in the kit and administered to the patient. So it's one way of rolling out in a broader market those treatments rather than just in specialised centres like Peter Mac or Memorial Sloan Kettering. You know, how do you get it to other hospitals and do that? And there are different models for that. You know, there's a central model where you load it up with your isotope and ship it out. But this is another one that, and I think it's going to be quite interesting to see which one of those works better, and maybe one will work better in some situations and one in the other.
Sorry, Tim, there's an area that I'm just sort of like Christian was saying and Brad was just saying about supply, and I haven't looked into it in a great detail, I must admit, but I do know that one of the areas that nuclear medicine, or whatever you call it now, can really improve the situation is that I know that, for example, yttrium-90 from a strontium generator is actually coming from nuclear waste, and so I don't know what the alpha supply line would look like from the actinides and so forth would look like from nuclear waste feed. I've never really looked into it, but it would be an interesting exercise to see how much is there, how much is extracted from nuclear waste.
Well, it's
you know,
it's interesting you mentioned that, David, because we spoke to a company that Bill Gates is actually the chair of, and I've forgotten the name of it, but it was a company that was taking waste and generating actinium or getting the actinium from that waste in the US. And I'm not sure that we spoke to them at JP Morgan like 2 years ago, and haven't seen them since. But
TerraPower.
yeah.
TerraPower.
Are they still around, or have they disappeared?
No, they're still around.
They're still around, but yeah, they don't, well, we should be civilized. They don't seem to be making a lot of progress. But I think your point, David, is interesting. I mean, I guess, yeah, so you've got actinium is thorium route, that's nuclear waste, lead-212, that's nuclear waste. So iodine-131, obviously, it's a fission byproduct.
Yeah.
Yttrium, fission byproduct, can be. So, you know, I think it's a fair point. I guess, you know, the reality for actinium, for example, I mean, I'd love to believe that we would lower the bar on the radiation safety and radiation biology for things like actinium. Like, for example, if we were really comfortable with the thorium route, we'd have a lot more actinium immediately available. I mean, Oak Ridge could do a lot more. The Russians have got plenty of thorium skids lying around. So we could potentially get actinium moving faster. It's just that I think the contaminant profile worries people a little bit. Rightly or wrongly, like, you know, that's a patient-specific question. If you're giving a drug to a patient that's got end-of-life, you know, metastatic disease, I'm not sure a bit of thorium breakthrough is the key concern, right? But then there's waste issues and stuff associated with it. So, you know, it's not so simple. And I think we all spend a lot of time on the isotope piece, frankly. I certainly, I mean, I prior to COVID, you know, I would probably do 200,000, you know, miles a year in search of isotope, you know, and that supply chain mastery is the key thing for a radiopharmaceutical company. And we've spent $100 million getting our supply chain together. It's cost us $100 million to do that. Right. To be able to globally ship a product, you know, we can cover about 60 countries today in a pinch with some of the core isotopes that we use. But I think, you know, for example, for actinium, I mean, the only real way that the actinium supply chain is going to get big is if people start getting comfortable with the idea of doing, you know, radium-226 bombardment with a cyclotron. And that is not for the faint-hearted. I mean, when that goes wrong, it goes pretty spectacularly wrong.
Right.
You know.
I mean, we're in the same boat with phosphorus 32. I mean, fortunately, we've got Opal because our supply line has really improved with Opal, and Tim can attest to this. But if you're making it by the neutron bombardment rate, it's pretty slow, but we get there. There is a way of there is a theoretical generator for P32. It's just that you've got to make, I think it's zirconium at something like 105-year half-life, and they've made it once in the Los Alamos project, and they never tried again. So it's not something that we're really pursuing. But yeah, it's tricky. The supply line in this industry is not a trivial thing. It can make or break a successful company. I mean, look at Curium have to be, with a 1-day half-life on holmium, I'm not sure how those guys do it, but they have to be close to their market and their reactor, I would imagine, is what their planning will be.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for those that are in the industry, they understand the complexities of the radionuclide manufacturing process, notwithstanding the half-life of some of these isotopes you're looking at and the logistics to move those products around the world to, you know, to label them with your delivery drugs. The research and the development that goes into just industrializing that radionuclide production takes a long time. I've been at ANSTO 11 years. Our lutetium program started about 6 years before I got here, and we've only been manufacturing under license, not through our own development, for about 6 years at an industrial scale. And that was acquiring the IP from a company that had started before us. And I think, you know, there's a little bit of actinium and some of these other radionuclides available, but at the industrial scale, to quality that you need to put to develop to put into humans, we're still, you know, there's a lot more that we have to do.
I think it's very clear that, you know, part of the nuclear medicine, or what we want to call it moving forward, is a supply and logistics game. You know, having your asset is important, and having the approvals in your asset is creates the most value. But being able to get your product to the patient in a timely manner is just as difficult a problem to overcome as the sort of product development phase. Brad touched upon something around the investment portfolio and pipeline and the investment appetite for the industry, and, you know, saying, you know, and rightly so, we're seeing some of these emerging companies such as Telix and Oncosil sort of educating some of the investors. But on the other side, we've seen some very big exits from companies like Algeta. There's a Figo product to Bayer. What's your current thinking around the investment appetite for nuclear medicines?
I'm happy to tackle that.
Thanks, Chris.
I mean, we see plenty of money flowing into the field now, both in the public markets and in terms of venture-backed or private equity. So yeah, there's been a plethora of small companies like ours that have grown over the last 5-6 years. For me, when I was looking at creating Telix, the catalyst was looking at, for example, the AAA IPO, the Lantheus IPO, or at least the second attempt at the Lantheus IPO. You know, there are a number of fairly meaningful transactions that sort of started to show that, you know, that the river was flowing again. And I think that, I mean, the two major drivers for the financial engagement with the field is really, as we've just been talking about, evidence that the supply chain is more real for the therapeutic radionuclides. And that, by the way, that's based, you know, no small part on investment by some, you know, by governments as well, right? Because, you know, it's not the private sector that's generally running nuclear reactors in most of the countries. So, so this is an example where government investment and government collaboration with private sector is really important. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that when you have a supply chain begets standardization of production and clinical activity. So instead of the field being a whole lot of little disparate hobby shops in the basement of sort of tertiary referral cancer centers, you can actually start to run pretty decently sized multi-center clinical trials. And when you can get the evidence that backs the, you know, the clinical utility, then that's when big pharma starts to take notice, and that becomes then the catalyst for investment flowing into the space. So I think that that's the knock-on effect, and that's how we are where we are today. And I think over the next 10 years, the nuclear medicine field is going to be very vibrant. There's tons of appetite to throw money at it. The only thing we have to be careful about is that we have to make sure that the investor base is well educated, because I already see money being thrown at stupid companies. And it's only going to take a number of, you know, very visible failures in the space. I mean, failure is great, you know, but failure educates a market and makes it more pointed and more effective and more efficient. But, you know, we have to have a an investor and an analyst space that really understands what the tough parts of this industry are, so that the money flows into companies that really do understand, you know, how to manage things like supply chain risk.
Yes, Chris, has anyone else got anything they'd like to add to that response?
I'd agree with what Chris is saying, and it also I find in my experiences that I think investors are the investors are there and they're keen to come in. I think they need to appreciate at different times along the timeline where the hurdles are going to be, and you know, when they're investing, what that means. So you know, for a startup that doesn't have it's in their very early trials, I think there has to be an appreciation for where that's up to. I'm not too sure that sometimes in Australia we don't have that, at least locally here. Globally, it's easier. That it's going to take another 5 years at minimum and cost probably another 2 to 3 capital raise to get there. Sometimes I think that's missing. People say, okay, you've started your clinical work. Are you ready to, when are you going to be selling? You know, and you think, well, no, we're actually still quite a ways from that. Because there's always another layer of regulatory in this field. We have our medical regulatory to clear, so you CE marking or your FDA or whatever, but then you always have your nuclear regulatory as well, and that can take then just to get a centre to use the product can be another challenge as well, because they all of a sudden they don't have phosphorus or whatever on their license, so there's another layer of regulatory that this industry has over the top of it. I think sometimes that's missing in when people should invest and how long it's going to be for the investment to realise some gain.
Brad or Rosanne, would you like to comment, or should we move on to another area?
I think just to note that when we did start this 3 or 4 years ago, it was like, radiation, what do you want to do that for? And we're definitely past that. So, you know, it has the sentiment has certainly changed.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I think in the last sort of 5 to 7 years, certainly the investors, the questions you're being asked are much more informed than, you know, some time ago.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've given a good overview of what the industry looks like. The technology platform mix across this space is quite broad. You know, we've got small molecules, biosimilars, which are targeting vectors like antibodies and peptides, and then materials like polymer and silicon. You know, I'm sure some of those out there in the discussion on the Zoom here will be working with similar types of assets in biotech or even in the university context. What is your advice to those who may be interested in exploring potential nuclear medicine approaches for their existing assets?
Go for it with all speed. Go for it.
But do good due diligence on your CROs and your service providers. You know, make sure they have got some track record, and you know, although it's down the front end with antibody, we used Catalan to make our batch of antibody, and they did a fabulous job. They actually kept to time and pretty much to cost. And you know, I think that as David said before, when you've got investors to manage about expectations, and you're actually handing some of this process over to other people who you can't directly control, you've got to be pretty sure that they can deliver for you.
Mm.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, Brad. And I think the other thing is, yes, go for it, but that comprehensive understanding of the value chain, the ease of manufacturing, understanding where your radionuclide supply can be or will be, or who's investing at every stage of that manufacturing process, not just your own targeting drug. The regulatory hurdles are high, they take time, and you know, making sure that you've got an investor base that also understands some of those challenges, particularly when, as a startup, when you're outsourcing a lot of your activities, be you CRO or your CMO, there's a lot of moving parts.
You know, I can't stress how much for anyone starting out to engage with various regulatory bodies, the medical and the nuclear, as early as you possibly can. I guard that statement, so I don't think you're going to enjoy the experience, but you really need to get in front of whatever your technology is going to look like and the final design. You really do need to engage with regulatory authorities as early as you possibly can, because it's one of the biggest hurdles you're going to have to overcome.
Chris, have you got any comments? I know that you reviewed, I think it was 300 assets when you were looking to establish Telix. What are the things that you were looking for?
I don't know if it was 300 assets, but it was a lot. Maybe you can shave, maybe a zero off and
Okay.
double it. But yes, it was. I mean, I've been in the field for a long time, and so is my co-founder, who runs a CRO that specializes in nuclear medicine drug development. So I guess we had a fairly good lay of the land in terms of, in terms of what sort of assets are available. Look, I think all the comments about, managing that process effectively, and I think David's comment, I often say to investors that the important thing with organizations like the FDA and European competent authorities, and even to some extent the TGA, is to engage early and often. I don't actually, I see David's point, dealing with regulators is sort of a headache and can be a bit daunting, but I sort of view dealing with regulators, I think there's a positive element to it. Most people that work at the FDA or the TGA are good scientists that want to be part of improving human health, protecting and improving human health. And I think if you take that lens when you deal with the regulator, and you have that respect that those people are there to fulfill a particular task, it's not about standing in your way of success. It's about protecting and benefiting human health. If your product genuinely benefits human health and you can show a safety, a safety profile that aligns with the risk benefit for that patient, there's no reason for a regulator to be in your way. And I say that, with a bit of bluster, because we've just had an NDA accepted today, a new drug application accepted today, and that's an extremely hard thing to do. I mean, that was 2 weeks. Gosh, I wish it was 2 weeks. 2 years of work for us. I haven't slept for 2 weeks, which is why 2 weeks came into my head, I have to admit. But I think that we did consult along the way regularly, and that sort of tends to eliminate the surprises. And I think the challenge for Aussie companies in particular, we shouldn't assume that this is an Australian-centric forum, but inevitably it will be somewhat Australian-centric. I think Aussie companies are a bit daunted dealing with overseas regulatory agencies. They tend to have to work with an agent until they get to a certain critical mass. I mean, we're at the stage now where we're acting as our own agent and dealing with the FDA, and we're getting our own e-publication processes in place internally and stuff like that. But most companies have to work through third parties. That's expensive. There's a lot of preparation involved. The style and timbre of communications from regulatory agencies are distinct. Never ever show an investor correspondence with a regulatory agent, because they'll shit their pants when they read it. The FDA could approve your drug and it will still feel like that you've been, arraigned for a colonoscopy. It'll have that sort of timbre to it. So all of that costs, it takes a lot of preparation and it costs a lot of money to do it. And so there's a reluctance to do it. And then unfortunately, then you get to the end of the journey and then people have surprises because they didn't engage along the way. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. Having said all that, I'll probably fall flat on my face with one of our programs in the next, month or something, and then you can all kind of mock me for it. But that's genuinely what I feel is the right approach.
I have to say, Tim, that I agree with the way I actually enjoy engaging with the regulatory. So I do actually agree with Kristen on that you've got to do it, and it is fun, and you have to appreciate, have to empathise with them, that they are the barrier between you, if you think your technology is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and the general public, and you see, you've got to empathise with that. One thing I do say with a lot of the medical regulators is that the knowledge of radiobiology science, dosimetry, whatever is not strong. I wouldn't rate it as strong. So therefore, we've had to spend, for example, a lot of trips, a lot of time actually educating different regulatory bodies on our MERD dosimetry, all that sort of stuff. So whereas you might go in with to the device regulators with a stent, a cardiac stent, which is fairly, they understand that. They don't tend to understand oncology treatments for using nuclear products. It's an education process. It's not a. Some people don't enjoy. I actually don't mind it. It's fine. I actually don't have a problem with it. But I just can't stress enough to people that you have to engage constantly and early with all of your regulatory bodies. Otherwise, to Chris's point, avoiding surprises.
Mm-hmm. I think your comment, though, David's really sort of make it like a, we could go and grab a hotel room and just leave.
No, why do we do that? Yeah, okay.
But I think you're right. There is an education component to it, and and sometimes when you get preliminary feedback on a consultation, you look at it and you scratch your head and you go, gosh, are they that stupid? But you have to realize that it's not about it and signaling an intent to sort of, quash your foray of regulatory approval. It's just really a lack of understanding about the radiation biology and trying to understand radioactive drug products and implantable devices from a traditional product development lens is pretty much a futile effort. So yeah, I would agree that there's a large degree of patience and education required. But, we work in Europe with the Danish Medicines Agency. We use them as our reference competent authority for our prostate imaging product in Europe. And they're fantastic. I mean, their level of knowledge of the radiation biology, but they've had numerous products where they've acted as a reference competent authority. They've had the Algeta product, the radium dichloride, they had Lutathera. And so they've built a real track record in team and understanding. I think the French competent authorities really understand the radiation biology extremely well because France has such an incredibly well-established, commercial nuclear industry. But there's such conservatism in that organization that it just takes forever. We had a phase 3 trial for our zirconium radiolabeled antibody in kidney cancer. I think it took 17 days for the Dutch competent authority to approve the study, and I think it took the French 9.5 months.
Yeah, right.
And we argued over a half a millisievert. I mean, we really. So it's a different world, that's for sure.
I don't think that regulatory issues around educating the regulator on emerging technologies is stands alone in this field. I think it's with everything, even in big nuclear projects and reactor developments. The regulator is always set up at the technology level of the previous reactor they did, and because there's such big long timelines, when you put a new reactor project up, some of that timeline is educating the regulator on the transition in technology that's happened across that period of time since the previous generation of reactor was built. So it's not just in the nuclear medicine space that we have these regulatory issues. It's education process, and obviously some regulators have more experience than others. And I think in the medicines and therapeutics space, only a few years ago, most of the applications were for small molecule drugs, and that's the baseline we're coming from. They become medicinal chemists, and they move into TGA or FDA, and their backbone is organic chemistry, not necessarily biologics and physics-based medicines like nuclear medicines.
It's true, yeah, very true.
Rachel, I think we're probably at time to move into smaller breakouts. Is that right?
Yeah, look, there are a few questions that have come up on the board, and I will suggest if people have questions, now's the time to throw them in. I just wondered, Chris, there's been one around Telix's experience in Asia and China in particular. And I just wondered if you wanted to, because I know there's probably a bit of interest on the group to hear about that. Did you want to touch on that for a sec?
Sure. So one of the things that I think is very special about nuclear medicine is it's very cost effective. It's not easy and the supply chains are not simple. It's not cheap to produce the medicine, but in terms of the cost benefit to the patient, I think it's an extraordinary technology. And when we can give targeted radiation in such an effective way. I mean, the overwhelming evidence of the last 10 years is that you can take an antibody with an ADCC effect or you know, a small molecule binding to a receptor like a somatostatin analog, and you will achieve some clinical utility from that. But if you whack a radioactive payload on it, you know, you really supercharge that effect. And so what I think that means very importantly is that in a lot of countries around the world, nuclear medicine represents an oncology solution that has almost no parallel in terms of its economics. Now, the double-edged sword of that is that most of those countries don't have the supply chain in place. So, for example, we've just signed a 400 million plus royalties deal with China Grand Pharma to tackle our core portfolio in China. And as part of that agreement, we are going to have to work together to build a supply chain, which is pretty exciting in a sense, but it's also pretty daunting because you know, it's a non-trivial exercise. And I think what that also means is that from a Theranostics perspective, we can't just think about mainstream technologies that we all take for granted, like you know, PET imaging, for example. We have to think more about traditional and conventional nuclear medicine technologies like single photon imaging if we're going to do Theranostics. And so what that means, in my opinion, is the target product profile between, you know, European, Australian, US, Canada, and a handful of other countries is probably a little different than for some of the Asian or Latin American markets. But if you can nail that problem down, that's a massive market opportunity. I mean, it's a really, really huge unmet medical need, not just because of the lack of therapies in some key disease areas, but the lack of cost-effective therapies in a lot of those disease areas. So we're really excited about working in China. We already have a team in Japan, and we're actually clinically active. We're talking about regulator education. I mean, it took us basically 2 years to convince the PMDA to let us use zirconium in Japan. We now manufacture zirconium-based products in Japan, which is it's kind of amazing concept. We're getting more active in Korea. Korea's got a very sophisticated nuclear medicine, you know, landscape and a fairly, you know, straightforward regulator. KFDA is more like the FDA or the TGA. Then you got Singapore, which has got probably more cyclotrons per square kilometer than just about anywhere else on the planet. Not all of them running at high utility. And so, you know, there's opportunities there to service, you know, regional markets as well. So I think Asia in particular is really exciting. And I'd like to think, you know, I mean, we pester ANSTO about it all the time, as Rosanne knows. You know, I have nothing except positive and fondness statements to say about ANSTO, but with the fondness caveat being that, you know, governments are governments still. I'd like to see a bit more risk appetite out of ANSTO in terms of servicing the region. And it's not about lowering safety thresholds or taking a reckless approach to production profiles, but actually the region needs a strong, capable, regular, consistent isotope supply. And it's such an unmet medical need that if it doesn't happen, that window of opportunity, which I think is about 3 years, will disappear. And, you know, China Nuclear has a budget now of about $4 billion to build nuclear capacity in China. And I have no doubt that they will roll that out in the most aggressive way. I think that the Russians have finally worked out that they've been poorly servicing essentially the entire world's core material supply, including lutetium, for, you know, the last, I don't know, 2 decades. And that if they could actually service a domestic nuclear medicine market, they would be powerhouses in the world. They would be powerhouses of nuclear medicine. So I think that the role of Australia and you know, Australian government enterprise and Australian private sector enterprise in really delivering nuclear medicine solutions to Asia, I think it's a profound opportunity with a very, very limited window for impact. That's my viewpoint. So that was a bit long-winded again, but hopefully, Rachel, that sort of
No, that's
yeah,
great, Chris.
gives you some views.
It actually poses the next question, which I might get Rosanne to kick off. And I'm aware of the time, so what we might do is make this the last question before we go into smaller groups. Rosanne, I mean, Chris has just mentioned what a wonderful opportunity Australia has in this industry, and I just wondered, you know, if you could ask the universe for something, and I do want to get all the panelists, all the contributors today to let us give us some insight into what would it take, do you think?
So if I had an open checkbook, I think, look, there's a world of opportunities for ANSTO. I mean, having Australia's only nuclear reactor, we've also got, you know, other infrastructure that is the basis for manufacturing these range of radionuclides that we've been talking about today, and also the future radionuclides that we're looking at that, you know, potentially will start into clinical practice in the next 5+ years, and then hopefully, if successful, will industrialize sort of in 10 years. Bottom line, as a government agency, is having the checkbook to do that early stage investment. ANSTO is a diverse organisation, so whilst nuclear medicine is very important, there's a range of other activities that we have as well. So sometimes it ends up being competing priorities, but I would concur with Chris. There's, you know, there is a wealth of opportunity within Australia and also for ANSTO to serve that Asia Pacific region. And hopefully we will get there.
Sorry, Rosanne.
That's okay, Chris.
It was a plug, but it was like a plug with bits of dried food attached to it.
With an empty checkbook attached to it.
With an empty checkbook.
Would any?
No, if the checkbook was full, we'll be fine. We can talk later.
I always tell Rosanne I can write her a check as big as she wants and just not guarantee that it's going to cash the next day.
Would any others, before we break into small groups, would any of the other contributors like to add to this discussion on what will it take to make, what would they have if they could wish anything from the universe or ask anything from the universe to make this industry thrive?
Yeah, from my perspective, definitely expand the ANSTO, but I think Chris's point about there's about 3-year window. I'd agree with that. That's roughly about right to move on this, because eventually, yeah, the powerhouses of China and so forth who do have a seemingly endless budget will move in on the space, and I think we can hold on to our graduates, all of that sort of stuff. If we invest in this area, we can really hold on to some high-end intellects and keep them here in this country and build a good enterprise base for doing it, and maybe even support private reactors. It's very difficult to do, but you never know, it might happen.
Hope so, but yes, that's a long shot, I think, for Australia. So, yeah. No.
Tim, any parting comments, Tim, on this one?
Well, this is outside, it won't advance the industry, but I think if you could have any wish, you'd have no cancer, therefore no need to have the discussion in the first place. But that's not reality. So,
well, I want to thank you all for what was a wonderful conversation that went far too fast. So thank you very much for that. We're about to break into small discussion rooms just for people to have the opportunity to chat some more. But for those that have to drop off, thank you so much. Thank you to the contributors for what was a great conversation. Follow the prompts, and I'll see you in a room in a moment.